Great, and thanks very much for inviting me along today. Very pleased to be here. I'm going to take Wayne's comments. He's already gone, has he? He's already disappeared. Can't pin him down for long. To heart, so it's going to be rather informal. So whilst it sounds like I've got a well-thought-through paper here, from object diasporas to museum affordances, it could be subtitled Some Random Thoughts on Museums and Diasporas and Objects. And I'll mainly be thinking about historical ethnographic collections, mostly collected in the colonial era in ethnographic museums around the world. Although a lot of my earlier work actually around people diasporas and place and so on was much more about contemporary kind of articulations of this idea of diaspora. So I'll largely be talking to some slides. Just give me, is someone going to give me a signal when my time, yes, because I may drift off. So in the most literal sense, ethnographic museum collections constitute so many diasporas, insofar as they've been scattered from the places of their origin, as it were. A very literal idea, etymological meaning of diaspora, to scatter. They reside in one place, but their identity is, or seems to be, inextricably linked or associated or grounded in another place. But beyond that very literal understanding of the kind of dispersal of collections, my interest really is, as again Wayne was suggesting, is about how this concept, diaspora, which of course is laden with very particular histories and connotations, might constitute a kind of a productive metaphor through which to think both about the poetics and the politics of ethnographic collections. Do they exist in a state of exile, longing, as it were, for return? Or are they quite at home in their diasporic locations? How do they exist in and materialize positions between these kind of dichotomized poles of exile and diasporic belonging? So how can thinking through diaspora help us think through the status, value, and ethics of ethnographic museum collections and address these perennial debates about the relevance of ethnographic museums and their collections today in this so-called post-migrant society in which the state of diaspora has become general in a way? We're all seemingly from somewhere else. We all have multiple affiliations, multiple senses of where we belong. So going back to some of the kind of discourse around diaspora, particularly since the 1990s, Tololian in the 1990s mentioned that diasporas represent the exemplary communities of the transnational moment. And following that kind of work, there have been various attempts to taxonomize this idea of diaspora. So we have the kind of paradigmatic victim diaspora, we have trade diasporas, imperial diasporas, labor diasporas, and so on and so forth. Each expressing a different kind of relation, particularly in terms of what motivated the dispersal from that originary place. So the paradigmatic victim diaspora is very much about coercion, senses of exile, longing for return. But this also recognized that there's a diversity of motives or things that involve varying degrees of coercion or kind of voluntary migration from places, whether that was to seek a better life elsewhere, economic migration, and so on and so forth. And in many respects, the circumstances around the dispersal of populations determines the nature of the diasporic condition in which those communities find themselves in. Although, as we know, that in itself is a gross simplification, and part of what I'd like to do in the first kind of bit of what I'll talk about is to, complicate that notion that if your ancestors were forcibly dispersed, that necessarily means you exist in a state of exile and a longing to return to the original homeland. Of course, we know that things are a lot more complicated than that. Nevertheless, despite recognizing this diversity of causes of population dispersal, the connotations and the motifs of the paradigmatic diaspora associated with exile and return is still very dominant. And actually an earlier research of mine, which was largely based on people people who asserted a kind of Scottish diasporic identity. What was interesting there is that you found that there was a desire, as it were, to align their identities, their cultural identities, with a victimological narrative. It's not only the people that migrate and things that migrate, but also ideas and discourses and cultural narratives. So in my doctoral work, which eventually became this book, Highland Homecomings, one of the things I was interested in looking at there was this idea, the articulation of this notion of diaspora, and particularly how cultural narratives associated with biblical images of the Jewish diaspora, with stories of the Black Atlantic and so on, were actually appropriated into people's senses of identity, even though their ancestors may have been economic migrants in the early 20th century, let's say. Okay. So I was interested in how people came to align themselves with these dominant cultural narratives as a way of narrating a sense of dis-ease, of malaise that's actually much more harder to narrate by finding these cultural narratives which they could plausibly align their ancestral migrations to. And in the Scottish case, this is very much the narrative of the Highland clearances and what's framed as a kind of conflict between England and Scotland. Although this involves a kind of perversion of history, as it were, if we're taking history as some kind of notion of evidentiary kind of fact. These are all very problematic terms, of course. So nevertheless, the point is here is that the connotations of different forms of diasporas shift around, and quite often it's the victimological narrative of exile and return that comes to be articulated, even where it may perhaps not be appropriate. And I'll come back to this in a moment. I should say what I'll try and do here is talk a little more generally about this notion of diaspora, unpack this concept a little bit, and then talk about a couple of kind of case examples relating this to material culture and specifically to kind of museums, and thinking through why this might be a useful term to consider in relation to museums. So this idea of exile return is kind of premised on a particular notion of cultural identity, which is about a kind of essentialized identity, this static kind of isomorphism between the person, an ethnicity, a place, a culture, a material culture, a language, as if these things are neatly bounded up together. And of course, how objects migrate with people but still link them back to these places, these essences. So we have material culture that travels with people. We have also immaterial culture, stories, songs, languages that also move with people. And again, in that Scottish context, these motifs in poetry, in music, in material culture are very apparent. And they're largely an exilic imagination that's being articulated and brought into this positioning in the present. This notion of a world made up of bounded, essentialized culture zones from which people become exiled is, of course, part and parcel of what, particularly in the 19th, early 20th centuries, the project of anthropology in many respects constructed. And so we're in the context of ethnographic collections assembled in those periods. A lot of the time it was precisely to construct this notion of bounded identities that we're trying so hard ever since, in a way, to kind of undo and unshackle ourselves from this notion. And in many respects, by critically thinking through this notion of diaspora, which runs contrary to a lot of cultural politics, because there's, of course, particularly in those contexts where people's ancestors were coerced into migrating or being taken elsewhere, the investment in that notion, in that sense of identity, is paramount. So it's a problematic criticism as well, because, of course, one has to be mindful of the politics involved in all of this. However, if we think in a broader sense about the human condition, of course, the history of humanity is a history of movement and migration. So whether we're talking in deep pasts in terms of the dispersal of human being around the world, or of course in terms of much more recent human movement. So there's a diversity of forms of coercion or voluntarism that led to this dispersal of people. We can't level all of that and say, well, we're living in this transnational world that all migrations are somehow equal. Of course, there are histories which shape them in very different ways, and we need to be mindful of this. Whilst there's this rhetoric of cosmopolitanism and mobility and being at home in these diasporic contexts, of course, as Stuart Hall reminds us, we need to think very much about how these, the understanding of these different diasporic formations, as it were, inflected by these particular histories. Stuart Hall's kind of discussion of diaspora I still find very inspirational, even though we're talking of a piece of work now nearly 30 years ago, of course. I think a key point here is that even within those so-called victim diaspora contexts, this notion of the essentialized identity is, as he put it, very much a positioning. Okay, these are strategic, not always self-consciously strategic, but nevertheless they do some work, as it were, these particular identifications with particular other places. But as Stuart Hall reminds us in this quote, we're wrong to place, to regard as this idea of truth, as it were, being buried, the true identity of self buried somehow within oneself and linking to these other places. And he articulates this here in terms of cultural identity is not only a matter of being, that sense of an essential identity, but also of becoming. And I think this is a very powerful notion, this notion that our identities are shaped very much in the present and in the future, as it were, on this kind of trajectory. And the particular articulations of these histories are part of our positioning, the politics of what we're wanting to do with our own identities, as it were, in the present. The past, he writes, continues to speak to us, but it no longer addresses us as a simple factual past, since our relation to it, like the child's relation to the mother, is always already after the break. It is always constructed through memory, fantasy, narrative, and myth. Cultural identities are the points of identification, the unstable points of identification or sutra, which are made within the discourses of history and culture, not an essence but a positioning. And of course, thinking through this in relation to museum collections, historical museum collections, these two are resources which are used in this positioning process. These are the resources which people, along with other kinds of narratives, etc., can be articulated in this project of positioning. I also always am drawn to James Clifford's kind of comment here. Diaspora cultures mediate in a lived tension the experience of separation and entanglement, of living here and remembering, desiring another place. That sense of inbetweenness, which is, I think, profoundly tied up with the diasporic condition, which, as I mentioned earlier, in some senses has become a general condition. Nevertheless, we have this idea of a dichotomy between the roots and the routes or roots, being and becoming, different positionalities in this kind of cultural field. It's interesting to think how this then kind of can be mapped on to thinking of material culture and thinking of museum collections in ethnographic museums in particular. We tend to associate ethnographic collections with this kind of idea of roots in some respects. As I mentioned at the beginning, by definition, they've come from elsewhere. They're residing in these diasporic in these diasporic locations, and yet part of the work that they're put to is always linking back to that other place. They're articulated within that kind of a way. So they themselves are kind of, we're celebrating their rootedness. But in many respects, that also is a kind of a problematic, because part of that sense, these are exiled objects, is this notion of return, of course. So discourses of repatriation become very easily articulated. If, however, we think of, along Stuart Hall's kind of line of becoming and the roots of diaspora, where actually they're not separate from that originary place, but somehow also at home and in a creative space of diaspora, a positive creative space of diaspora, it complicates that straightforward notion of, you know, where do these things belong? And of course, they belong somewhere in between these poles. So to think straightforwardly, we can take an example where there's some kind of unequivocal kind of coercive dispersal of objects, and always turn to the Benin treasures, as it were, as an example, simply partly because they're so powerfully expressed in these kind of contemporary photographs and so on, collections that have been dispersed, particularly around Europe and North America, through the Benin punitive expedition of 1897. So we might see this as the kind of the classic victim object diaspora, objects that are in exile, that have been forcibly removed, and which long to return in some senses, and hence the politics around that. I'd like to just contrast that with another case, and I'll be talking a little bit more about this person here. This is Northcote Thomas, who was the first government anthropologist in Britain, but appointed by the Colonial Office in the early 20th century to conduct a series of ethnographic surveys in southern Nigeria and Sierra Leone. And I'll come back to him, but what's interesting here is in the course of these surveys, he collected a huge amount of material, also took many photographs, sound recordings, and so on and so forth, but some really impressive collections. And what's unusual is that we have just the trace of his collecting practice evident in some of the correspondence that I've managed to dig out. And this is actually quite unusual to find some of this, because what we find in his correspondence, and these are letters to colleagues in the British Museum, to Joyce and Reed. Reed was the kind of effectively the keeper of ethnography at that time. Joyce was his kind of second in command. He's talking specifically about how he's purchasing these objects. So he's writing to Joyce here in 1909 from Nigeria. I'm sending, and by the way, Thomas was working in Benin City, 10 years after the punitive expedition. So in the interregnum, when the Oba was still exiled in Calabar. So it's close on the heels of that other collecting moment. I'm sending off collections shortly, about 200 objects, some rather dear, but prices are up in BC, in Benin City. Tell Balfour I'm sending him an iron lamp. I will buy him a brass one if he likes. They cost 12 and 6 to 15 shillings new, old ones correspondingly dearer. So in contrast to this notion of colonial loot, objects taken by force, what we see here is Thomas, the anthropologist, buying stuff at the market, a market that's determined by local sellers, you're setting the prices, these kind of things. Particularly the old stuff is expensive. You can commission the new stuff. So it's a very different narrative than we're used to hearing about the acquisition of things at this time in somewhere like Benin City. We find that the kind of the industry for these things is buoyant, that there's a vibrant market in the selling of these objects. Here's another letter to read. I've sent off during this last month some 1,300 objects. I've just got some wonderful secret society dresses, 4 in all. I've ordered all the jujus in Benin City to be carved, probable cost £25. I go from here to Sabongida, Abedi, Ida, etc., and can easily buy another 2,000 to 3,000 if you can find the money. If you cannot, I fear Berlin or the Yankees must have them. So this notion that Thomas, the anthropologist, is commissioning these ethnographic objects, these authentic objects, which will then be sent to somewhere like the British Museum. And of course, we see the kind of competition that's going on. The ethnographic museums in the States, in Berlin, who will have them if Thomas isn't there collecting them for Britain in this case. Okay. Interestingly, the British Museum didn't want any of this stuff, actually. Thomas made the mistake of thinking that he had a big budget from the BM to be spending on all of this. Reed reminded him that his budget of £50, which they discussed, was actually his whole collecting budget for a year. And why did he think that he alone should be spending this for him on this one expedition? Reed didn't like this idea that these things were bought on the market, or that he was commissioning these things to be made. Things that we'd now say, this is our ethical collecting practice these days. We find local craftspeople and so on, we commission these things for our museums. At that time, clearly this notion of authenticity, that the object shouldn't be something that suddenly you've just paid to be made, was not seen as part of this. So we're seeing a different kind of story here. However, before we get carried away to think that Thomas was a new man, as it were, not involved in these kind of colonial power relations and so on, he goes on in this same letter to read, I'm fit as a fiddle and cover 12 miles with my gun most days, hunting and so on. That was how I unearthed the dance dresses. They were in a bush house. I only got them by drawing up my force of police, 1 in number, and threatening some 50 chiefs, etc., that I would take them by force if they did not agree to sell. So that complicates things, of course. So on the one hand, he's purchasing things, he's not stealing them, these are not colonial loot, but there we go. This is within a broader context of colonial power relations, including the threat of violence, apparently. People are being forced to sell in certain context. So I don't want to paint our man Thomas as some kind of hero either. It's all about ambiguity then. And, that places us back in that middle zone, in the in-betweenness, which was the theme of this book. If Sandra had been there here this morning, she contributed a chapter, an interesting chapter, which relates, I think, to perhaps what she might have been saying here in this book as well. And how this diasporic place of in-betweenness is also manifest in the material flows in the colonial era. And what I especially liked about this Sierra Leonean Sunday Society mask that's on the front cover of this book is this spirit, after all, this is a spirit who's adorned with this European-style hat. And we can see how the hat, as it were, made this migration to West Africa and became a symbol of authority and so on in local power structures, but also cosmologies in terms of the spirit world and so on. At the same time as something like this mask moved in the opposite direction to Europe, initially for display in the colonial and Indian exhibition, of 1886. Ironically, it was articulated as this kind of, epitomizing the kind of the otherness of West Africa's kind of spirit worlds and so on, and yet there it has that Western hat. So inbetweenness as a kind of key thing to take from this notion of diaspora. To kind of shift, as it were, discourses and to think more about migration studies and, oh gosh, right, okay, really? I see, you reset the time, I looked at my, anyway, okay, I better speed on. The value of diasporas to homeland, okay, we've spoken about that idea of exile and return. One of the kind of key metaphors that I've been interested to explore is this idea of diasporic remittances. So within development studies, for instance, one of the key ways in which diasporas are invoked is through their value, their economic value to places of origin. Which the money that's sent back through family networks and so on far outweighs a lot of development budgets and so on, aid development budgets. So there's a keenness to open up what are so-called remittance corridors to ease those economic flows. This is a metaphor that I've kind of worked with in my work in Sierra Leone, for instance, to think of the diaspora of Sierra Leonean objects that have been dispersed from Sierra Leone and now reside in Europe and North America, and how we can think of the value of those objects in their diasporic locations for Sierra Leone, and to think through this idea of what symbolic value do they send back, and how, as museums, can we open up corridors, these remittance corridors, so that these values can return. And had I more time, I would tell you a little bit more about this project, which was all about digitization on the one hand, but also about thinking through this idea of how value could return by virtue of these diasporic relations. How can value return along those same corridors, as it were, that these objects have migrated through to find themselves in these ethnographic museums? So through various kind of collaborations, working, exchange, the return of information about objects to places where they were found, the return of histories, exchanges with teachers, curatorial exchanges, exhibitionary exchanges, celebrations. This is in the British Museum. The first time, I think, Sierra Leone has really been celebrated within the British Museum in any significant way. And an event here, that same Sunday Society masque, performing in the Grand Court, very much about the confluence of an object diaspora and a human diaspora. This was organised by Sierra Leoneans in London, after all. So very, very, very briefly, in conclusion, I just want to mention this project Museum Affordances, which was going to be the second half of my talk, had I not rambled on too much. An experiment, really, with this idea of the multiple investments in these historical ethnographic collections. Not only the source communities, as we are all familiar with, but also how do these intersect with diasporic communities? And this is something we're trying very much to think about in this project, re-entanglements. And so this is working with those collections from Northcote Thomas that I mentioned earlier. And part of this is about mapping those collections. They're all dispersed in different institutions. They've become divorced from each other. Sound has become divorced from image, has become divorced from object, and they've, in many respects, become divorced from these places that they were collected. So part of it's about doing that kind of real collections-based work. It's also about taking this material back. What does it represent to communities? The return of these diasporic objects, images and sounds to those same communities from which they were collected. So again, this kind of photo elicitation and the return of copies of this kind of material. However, and I'll just touch on this in conclusion, It's very much also about trying to engage with Sierra Leonean and Nigerian communities in these diasporic kind of positions. And I wanted to throw out another idea there about the digital diaspora, because this is a space, going back to Stuart Hall, and these resources which diasporic communities are drawing upon to shape their cultural identities and their narratives, how the digital is very important in this, in many respects, because this is the repository, this is the place where a lot of our collections and images end up being most accessible. And these are curated and debated in lots of interesting ways on Facebook and so on and so forth. And indeed, many of Northcote Thomas's photographs in particular have found their way through one way or another onto the internet. Actually, a very small percentage of those that are existing, which we're now trying to make more accessible, but nevertheless, it's interesting how they're there through digitized copies of books and so on and so forth. And I want to just read you this little quote from a woman that got in contact with me who wanted to see if she could get a copy of this, a high-quality digital copy of this, so that she could print it out and put it on her wall, because she'd got it off the internet, but of course it was just some pixelated little kind of thing. So I just want to read you this, because I think this really articulates something of the power of these. The image, this image, has possessed me since I first saw it, and I would greatly appreciate your help in being able to behold it every day in high definition. I'm a young Igbo woman raised in the United States, trying to weave together an image of pre-colonial Igbo life through early ethnographies and whatever of the rapidly fading intergenerational stories I can preserve. My brother, another stereotypical third culture kid, found a PDF of Northcote's book online a couple of years back, and the rest is history. Every time I look at that photo, I feel like I am in that square, behind the middle mask. I hope to open museums in Nigeria dedicated to Igbo history and culture, revive old community celebrations, and create programming and curriculum on all things Igbo and West African over time. I moved to Nigeria 3 months ago to get started, and you may be holding the finish line ribbon to step one. Get those spirits on the gallery wall in my living room. We all have to start somewhere. And I think this really is an everyday commonplace statement in many respects. It articulates so many people's desires to ground themselves, to find home, even though they're actually very much at home in this mobile space. And that a notion of how people can be transported through images, but also ethnographic objects and so on, and imagine themselves back in that originary space, that profound space of identity, I think is key. And these are other examples of trying to activate these kinds of collections with diasporic artists, with others. I think the key thing is to come back to this notion of affordance, which I haven't really mentioned at all, but just to say that this is the potential, the latent possibilities that reside in our collections and our ethnographic images and so on is immense. And it comes back to the role of the museum then within that, and our responsibility, our ethical responsibility, to find ways of activating this material, okay? Some, by chance, people come across these things, but in a way that's not good enough. I think our responsibility is to come up with the ways, the methods of actually demonstrating what this material can do. And the problems that raises, which I think I'll just leave you with, because of course we're trying to undo that sedentary image of the world where people's identities are only rooted in place, and where there's these senses of exile if one suddenly find oneself separate from that place. And so there's a problematics to that. Do we want to perpetuate that kind of rooted identity, the OOT version, or how can we both activate this material but ensure, as it were, that it doesn't provide a negative space, as it were, but it's a positive space? Is that our job too? Okay. Are we arbiters as museums and so on of how they're used? How can we ensure that it's a complicated story that's that's kind of appropriated, that's a productive, creative thing, rather than you know, this idea of an identity that we're trying to undo.